is never going to see progress for them.
I call the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
If ever there was a person and a speech that epitomised the history of the West Coast, then it was that one. Arrogant, patronising, preaching from someone sitting over in Christchurch about what is best for the West Coast, when his family, for generations, took the sawmilling and their profits over the hill. Mr. Speaker, this government wants to do the same thing here. And all I ask is the Minister and of Jerry Brownlee, put a clause in this bill that guarantees benefits for the West Coast. Mr. Speaker, we've heard all the pathetic excuses from Nick Smith dancing on the head of a pin, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'll put my credentials on the table. I was born into and grew in the bush, Mr. Speaker. My father purchased a bit of land that was bush, that was native forest, and slowly pushed it over to create a farm, Mr. Speaker. I lived in it. I know what the dynamics of it are, so don't come preaching from your bloody Fendleton home, Mr. Brownlee, about what happens in, Mr. Speaker, what happens in the bush of the West Coast. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Ockenvol's no better. Mr. Speaker, the history of our region is people like Mr. Brownlee and Mr. Ockenvol coming in, promising wonderful things to our region through sawmilling initially and through mining, and then packing their bags and moving out, Mr. Speaker, leaving the locals to try and find some job opportunities. Mr. Speaker, you would have thought that we would have learned over the generations. Well, indeed, it wasn't that long ago, in fact, only a couple of months, where the repetition of that sad event, sad reality, came back to haunt us, where people sitting on their butts in Christchurch at Solid Energy, a board appointed by a bunch of Tories in government, ruined that company by upping the rate of debt, increasing the dividend to the Tory government, and then, of course, collapsing when the inevitable coal price went down. Mr. Speaker, who suffered most? The West Coast people. So what we had was a natural event, Mr. Speaker. I accept Cyclone Ita. Mr. Speaker, it was quite significant. We haven't seen anything like that in living memory on our coast. Whether it's the 200,000, and I have certainly seen tens of thousands of hectares that have been severely damaged, Mr. Speaker. That is right. So I understand the potential value in the logs that are on the ground. I also understand the difficulties in extracting safely that timber from those forests. Mr. Speaker, if you talk to any experienced forester down there, they will tell you that that is perhaps some of the most dangerous forest and forestry activity that you can undertake, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, there are some valuable logs and timber there. But as the Minister himself said, most of that will have to be extracted by way of helicopter. And the timber that really is the only timber of value that can possibly pay for that high value extraction is indeed rimu. The previous speaker talked about matai, Mr. Speaker. There may be the odd matai tree there, but indeed it will be the rimu, Mr. Speaker. The reality of what happens every day that timber is on the ground is that in our climate, we do have breakdown very quickly, Mr. Speaker. We do have spoilage of the logs, and it is only the heart rimu that would indeed be of any value after 2 years, Mr. Speaker. I've had some interesting and robust discussions with my colleagues. I put on the table once again my knowledge from first-hand experience in the bush. I believe we can extract some of those logs, Mr. Speaker. I think we can do it economically and safely, but it will only be a very small amount of timber from those forests, and it will probably just be rimu. So should we take that opportunity, Mr. Speaker? Well, I've always said yes. I don't believe that it will. I don't believe that it will upset the biological cycle in the forest. Indeed, if we leave them all there, they might be bugs that end up looking like Mr. Brownlee. And that is that too much nutrient in one space is conducive to to not the very best of I guess, ongoing health and behaviour. Mr Speaker, it's done in jest, Mr Speaker. It's not a personal affront to Mr Brownlee. I'm saying that it comes from sitting in Fendalton, not on the West Coast. That's what happened. None of his relatives enjoyed that level of comfort as on the West Coast when they were indeed storming. Mr Speaker, can I just go back to Mr Smith, who very righteously, piously and pompously said that we should do this for West Coast benefit, and then refused to put in place minor amendments, which I will table, Mr Speaker, that will give preferential access for West Coasters, because I put before you the scenario that helicopter extraction, helicopters from Rotorua most likely, and logging gangs, again, possibly from Rotorua, onto trucks, possibly from Christchurch, taking those logs outside of the West Coast delivers very few benefits for our region. And you know what? West Coasters are a bit more astute now than they were when Mr Brownlee's ancestors came to our region. Mr Speaker, we had a story about Timberland's West Coast and the transition into exotics. Can I tell you the reason that we didn't know the exact volume of the exotic logs in the region is because Timberland's West Coast, a company run by a bunch of Tories appointed by the National Party in the 90s, Mr Speaker, was misleading the government in terms of what was happening in the forest. You can talk to anyone on the West Coast and they'll verify that. Mr Speaker, we were misled by a company that did not operate properly, Mr Speaker, did not operate ethically. In fact, in many West Coasters' views, destroyed the opportunity that we potentially had. Mr Speaker, moving on to the piece of legislation that we have now. It is again, as I say, one more arrogant piece of legislation proposing to offer huge and ongoing benefits to the people of the West Coast, and indeed offering opportunities for people to come in, to get a sweet deal with the Director General and take those logs outside of our region. Come back to the point about the 2 mills in our region that are capable of cutting the logs, and I'm sure they would welcome a few more logs. But talk to them about the market and about the fragile price, and it is high, Mr Brown is quite correct, and it should be high. But it's very, very easy to undermine the value of that timber on the market because, for whatever reason, the chicken and the egg, Mr Speaker, Rimu has fallen out of fashion with many furniture manufacturers and high-value uses. Mr Speaker, can I say that the risk to the market price of Rimu would indeed undermine the economics of some of this extraction. So I asked in my amendment as well that any permit to extract this includes a requirement for the person getting the timber to manage that timber onto the market in a way that does not undervalue or destroy the value of that timber. Mr Speaker, I support the extraction of these logs. There are opportunities potentially from it, but there's also a huge risk that if in the typical Tory arrogant way, they preach to us what we're supposed to get and then offer the opportunities to their mates and walk away with the benefits in their pocket, not ongoing and lasting benefits to our West Coast community. Mr Speaker, this is an opportunity, but it's one that in the hands of that government, without amendment to that legislation, those opportunities will be lost to our region. And I say to the Minister, Nick Smith, who is dancing on the head of a pin with his speech, Mr Speaker, that you ensure the opportunity, Mr Smith, I'm sure you would too, Mr Speaker, ensure the benefits accrue to our region, to the people who need jobs, to the 1,000 miners who have lost jobs because of that government's incompetent oversight of solid energy, Mr Speaker. This will offer a few jobs. It is crocodile tears to say that they care about the West Coast when they let 1,000 miners walk from Solid Energy because of your incompetent oversight of a company that should still be employing more miners in our region. Mr Speaker, this is an opportunity for the West Coast. I can't guarantee that those opportunities can be taken up.
Speaker.
I call the honourable member Eugenie Sage.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker, and thank you.